Hey everybody. Sorry for that extended pause. Um, this is the first part of, or first section of part 3 of Adorno's negative dialectics. Part 3 being titled Models. I'm just going to read through the table of contents real quick for the first section. The first section of part 3, which is titled Freedom. On the Metacritique of practical reason, quote, pseudo-problems, a split in the concern with freedom. Freedom, determinism, identity. Freedom and organized society. The impulse before the ego. Experimenta crucis. The addendum. The fiction of positive freedom. Unfreedom of thought. Quote, formalism. The will as thing. Objectivity in the antinomy. Dialectical definition of will. Contemplation. Structure of the third antinomy. Kant's concept of causality. The plea for order. The antithetical argument. Ontical and ideal moments. Repressive character of the doctrine of freedom. Self-experience of freedom and unfreedom. The crisis of causality. Causality is a spell. Reason, ego, superego. Potential for freedom. Potential of freedom. Against personalism. Depersonalization and existential ontology. Universal and individual in the philosophy of morals. On the state of freedom. Kant's, quote, intelligible character, end quote. Intelligibility in the unity of consciousness. Truth content of the doctrine of intelligibility. So here we go. Part 3 of Negative Dialectics. Models. Chapter 1. Freedom. On the Metacritique of practical reason. This is quite a long chapter, so I'm going to be breaking it down into a number of videos. First section, quote, pseudo-problems, end quote. The talk of, quote, pseudo-problems, end quote, comes from the Age of Enlightenment, when its point was to keep an unquestioned dogmatic authority from leading to considerations held to be impossible to decide for the very thought they were submitted to. There is a ring of this in the pejorative use of the word, quote, scholasticism, end quote. But pseudo-problems have long ceased to be regarded as those that defy rational judgment and mock the rational interest. Instead, they are viewed as the problems in which the concepts used are unclearly defined. A semantical taboo chokes off questions of facts as if they were mere questions of meaning. Preliminary considerations degenerate into a ban on considerations. What may or may not be reflected upon, however urgent, is relegated by a method blithely modeled after the current methods of exact science. Approved modes of proceeding, pure means, gain primacy over the ends, the goals of cognition. Experiences that balk at being unequivocally tagged get a dressing down. The difficulties they cause are said to be due solely to loose, pre-scientific nomenclature. The relevance of the question whether there is free will matches the technical term's recalcitrance at the desideratum of stating clearly what they mean. With legal and penal process, and finally the possibility of that which throughout philosophical tradition has been called morality or ethics, depending upon the answer. Our intellectual need does not allow us to be talked out of the naive question as a pseudo-problem. A poor ersatz satisfaction is offered to that need by self-righteously tidy thinking. And yet the semantical critique cannot be carelessly ignored. A question's urgency cannot compel an answer if no true answer is obtainable. Even less can the fallible need however desperate, point the direction of the answer. We would not have to reflect on the topics under discussion by judging their being or non-being, but by expanding their definitions, so it will include the impossibility to nail them down, as well as the compulsion to conceive them. This is what is attempted, with or without any such explicit content, in the antinomy of the chapter of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and in long passages of Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, although Kant, in the process, did not altogether avoid the dogmatic usage which, like Hume, he chides in other traditional concepts. He settled the conflict between facticity, quote, nature, and inescapable thoughts, quote, the intelligible world, and quote, in dichotomical fashion. Yet if we cannot point to freedom or the will as things in being, this does not mean, in analogy to simple pre-dialectical epistemology, that specific impulses or experiences cannot be synthesized under concepts to which no naturalistic substrate corresponds. Concepts that reduce those impulses or experiences to a common denominator in similar fashion, for instance, as the Kantian, quote, object, will reduce its phenomena. On that model, the will would be the lawful unity of all impulses that prove to be both spontaneous and rationally determined, as distinct from natural causality, although remaining in the framework of that causality. For outside the causal free connection, there can be no sequence of volitive acts. Freedom would be the word for the possibility of those impulses. This agile epistemo-critical solution does not suffice. However, the either or exacted by the question of free will is both succinct and worth asking, and in the concept of the will as the lawful unity of its impulses, it is indifferently glossed over. Above all, in the concept formation that takes its bearings from the model of the subjective philosophy of immanence, we tacitly assume a monadological structure of both will and freedom. Yet this structure is contradicted by the simplest of things, by way of what analytical psychologists call the, quote, test of reality, end quote. Countless moments of external, notably social reality, invade the decisions designated by the words, quote, will and, quote, freedom. If the concept of rationality in the will means anything at all, it must refer precisely to that invasion, however obstinately this may be denied by Kant. In fact, considering the actual decisions that permit us to ask whether they are free or unfree, what lends the eminently philosophical definition of those concepts its elegance, and its autarky as an abstraction. The psychological moment left over by that abstraction is scant as compared with the real complexion of within and without. From this impoverished, chemically pure remnant, we cannot tell what may be predicated about freedom, or about its opposite. To put it more strictly, and at the same time in more Kantian terms, the empirical subject that makes those decisions, and only an empirical one can make them, the transcendentally pure I, would be incapable of impulses, is itself a moment of the spatial, temporal, quote, external world. It has no ontological priority before that world. This is why the attempt to localize the question of free will in the empirical subject must fail. In that attempt, the line between the intelligible and the empirical realm is drawn in the midst of empiricism. This much of the thesis of the pseudo-problem is true. As soon as we ask about free will by asking about each individual decision As soon as our question detaches these decisions from their context and the individual from society, the question will yield to the fallacy of absolute, pure being in itself. A limited subjective experience will usurp the dignity of the most certain of things. There is something fictitious about the substrate of the alternative. The supposedly noumenal subject is transmitted within itself by that from which it is distinguished, by the context of all subjects. The transmission makes it what in its sense of freedom it does not want to be. It becomes heteronymous. Even where unfreedom is positively assumed, the conditions of unfreedom, as those of an eminently conclusive psychological causality, are sought in the isolated individual, which essentially is not so isolated. Not even the individual can find the fact of freedom in himself, and neither can the naive sense of acting arbitrarily be simply extinguished post festum by the theorem of determination. It was in a late phase only that the doctrine of psychological determinism was carried through. New section. A split in the concern with freedom. Ever since the 17th century, freedom has been defined as all great philosophy's most private concern. Philosophy had an unexpressed mandate from the bourgeoisie to find transparent grounds for freedom. But that concern is antagonistic in itself. It goes against the old oppression and promotes the new one, the one that hides in the principle of rationality itself. One seeks a common formula for freedom and oppression, ceding freedom to the rationality that restricts it, and removing it from empiricism in which one does not even want to see it realized. The dichotomy also refers to progressive scientification. The bourgeois class is in league with this insofar as it promotes production, but it must fear scientific progress as soon as that progress interferes with the belief that its freedom, already resigned to internality, is existent. This is the real background of the doctrine of antinomies. In the works of Kant and later in those of the idealists, the idea of freedom comes to be contrasted with the research of the individual sciences, of psychology in particular. Kant banishes the objects of this research to the realm of unfreedom. Positive science is assigned its place beneath speculation. In Kant's case, beneath the doctrine of the noumena. With the flagging of speculative vigor and the correlative evolution of individual sciences, the antithesis has been exacerbated to this extreme. The sciences paid the price in narrow-mindedness, and philosophy in non-committal vacuity. The more of its substance is confiscated by the individual sciences, as psychology, for instance, commandeered the genesis of character, on which even Kant still made wild guesses, the more embarrassing will the philosophemes on freedom of the will deteriorate into declamations. If the sciences keep searching for more legality, and if this search, ahead of any ideology, drives them to the side of determinism, philosophy becomes increasingly a depository of pre-scientific apologetical views of freedom. The antinomies of freedom is an essential moment of Kant's philosophy, as the dialectics of freedom is an essential moment of Hegel's. Later on, oaths to the idol of a sublime realm above empiricism were taken by academic philosophy, at least. Praise of the intelligible freedom of the individuals allowed empirical individuals to be held more ruthlessly accountable, to be more effectively curbed with the prospect of punishment that could be metaphysically justified. The alliance of libertarian doctrine and repressive practice removes philosophy further and further from genuine insight into the freedom and unfreedom of the living. Anachronistically, it approximates the jejune edification, which Hegel diagnosed as the affliction of philosophy. But because in individual science, the prime example is criminal jurisprudence, cannot cope with the question of freedom, it must reveal its own incompetence. It seeks help from the very philosophy whose bad, abstract antithesis to scientificism will not let it render that help. Where science finds problems insoluble and looks to philosophy for a decision, philosophy extends no more than the solace of a Weltanschauung. It is from this, then, that the scientists take their bearings, according to taste and, one must fear, according to the structure of their own psychological drives. The relation to the complex of freedom and determinism is laid into the hands of an arbitrary irrationality that wavers between dogmatic generalities and inconclusive, more or less empirical single determinations. In the end, one's position regarding that complex comes to depend upon his political need or upon the power he happens to recognize at the moment. Reflections on freedom and determinism sound archaic, as though dating from the early times of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, but that freedom grows obsolete without having been realized. This is not a fatality to be accepted. It is a fatality which resistance must clarify. Not the least of the reasons why the idea of freedom lost its power over people is that from the outset it was conceived so abstractly and subjectively that the objective social trends found it easy to bury. New section, Freedom, Determinism, Identity. Indifference to freedom, to the concept and to the thing itself, is caused by the integration of society, which happens to the subjects as if it were irresistible. Their interest in being provided for has paralyzed the interest in a freedom, which they fear would leave them unprotected. The mere mention of freedom sounds as bombastic as the appeal to it. This is what an intransigent nominalism adjusts to. Its relegation by a logical canon of objective antinomies to the realm of pseudo-problems has a social function. It serves to conceal contradictions by their denial, by holding on to data, or to their contemporary legatees, the protocol statements. One relieves the human consciousness of what runs counter to its outward situation. Under the rules of that ideology, only modes of human conduct in different situations would have to be discussed and classified. Talk of will or freedom would be concept fetishism. As actually proposed by the behaviorists, one would have simply to retranslate all definitions of the ego into reactive modes and individual reactions, which would then have solidified. No note is taken of the fact that what has been solidified brings forth new qualities, qualities distinct from the reflexes from which it may have risen. Unconsciously, the positivists obey the dogma of the superior, quote, first, which their metaphysical arch-enemies entertained. Quote, for the most revered is the oldest, and the sworn witness is paid the highest homage, end quote. In Aristotle's case, the first is the mythos, of which the out-and-out anti-mythologists retain the conception that whatever is can be reduced to what once has been. The equality of their quantifying method leaves no more room for evolving otherness than does the spell of fate. But what has been objectified in man, from their reflexes and against their reflexes, their character or their will, the potential organ of their freedom, this undermines freedom too. For it embodies the principle of domination in which men progressively submit. The identity of the self and its alienation are companions from the beginning. This is why the concept of self-alienation is poorly romanticist. Indeed, identity, the condition of freedom, is immediately and simultaneously the principle of determinism. There is a will insofar as a man objectified himself into a character. Toward himself, whatever that may be, he thus becomes something external after the model of the outward world of things that is subjected to causality. Besides the positivistic concept of, quote, reaction, a concept purely descriptive in intent presupposes incomparably more than it admits. It presupposes a passive dependence on each given situation. The interaction of subject and object is spirited away, a priori, while spontaneity is excluded by the very method. It is in line with the ideology of adjustment that men, ever ready to serve the world's course, should once more be broken of that contrary habit, spontaneity. If passive reactions were all there is, all would, in the older philosophical terminology, be receptivity. There could be no thinking. If the will takes consciousness, we may presume correlatively that consciousness takes a will. On the other hand, self-preservation in its history calls for more than conditioned reflexes, and thus it prepares for what it would eventually transcend. In doing so, it presumably emulates the biological individual's prescription of the form of his reflexes. The reflexes scarcely would be without any unity. The strengthening moment is the self of self-preservation. It is to this that freedom opens, as the difference that has evolved between the self and the reflexes. New section, Freedom and Organized Society. Without any thought of freedom, theoretical reasons for an organized society would be hard to find. Society in its turn will then curtail freedom. Both might be shown on Hobbes's construction of the social contract. Like Hobbes the determinist, a factually consistent determinism would sanction the bellum omnium contra omnes, war of all against all. If all men were equally predetermined and blind, every criterion of actions would fall by the wayside. The perspective of an extremity is unveiled. Whether the demand for freedom put forth so that men can live together does not contain a paralogism that freedom must be a reality lest there be horror. In fact, there is horror because there is no freedom yet. Reflection on the question of free will does not abolish the question, but turns it into one for the philosophy of history. Why have the two theses, quote, the will is free, and, quote, the will is unfree, become an antinomy? The historical origin of that reflection did not escape Kant, who expressly based the revolutionary claim of his own ethics on the delay in the reflection. Quote, man was seen to be bound to laws by his duty, but it occurred to no one that the only legislation to which man is subject in his own and yet universal, and that his only obligation is to act in line with a will that is his own, but is also universally law-giving, according to the ends of nature. End quote. By no means, however, did it occur to Kant whether freedom itself, to him an eternal idea, might not be essentially historic, and that not just as a concept, but in its empirical substance. Whole epochs, whole societies lack not only the concept of freedom, but the thing. To attribute the thing to them as an objective noumenon, even though totally hidden from the people concerned, would conflict with the Kantian transcendental principle, with the principle that is said to be found in the subjective consciousness, and would be untenable as the supposed consciousness at large if it were wholly lacking in any living person. Hence probably Kant's stubborn endeavor to demonstrate the moral sense as something that exists everywhere, even in the radically wicked. Otherwise, he would have had to say that phases in societies in which there is no freedom are not only not rational but not human, and the adherents of Rousseau would scarcely have stooped to saying that. Before the formation of the individual in the modern sense, which to Kant was a matter of course, in the sense meaning not simply the biological human being, but the one constituted as a unit by its own self-reflection, the Hegelian, quote, self-consciousness, unquote, it is an anachronism to talk of freedom, whether as a reality or as a challenge. Likewise, freedom which without impairment can only be achieved under social conditions of unfettered plenty, might be wholly extinguished again, perhaps even without leaving a trace. The trouble is not that free men do radical evil, as evil is being done beyond all measure conceivable to Kant. The trouble is that as yet there is no world in which there are flashes of this. In Brecht's work, men would no longer need to be evil. Evil, therefore, is the world's own unfreedom. Whatever evil is done comes from the world. Society destines the individual to what they are, even by their immanent genesis. Their freedom or unfreedom is not primary, as it would seem under the veil of the principium individuationis. For the ego, as Schopenhauer explained by the myth of Maya's veil, makes even the insight into its dependence difficult to gain for a subjective consciousness. The principle of individualization, the law of particularity to which the universal reason in the individual is tied, tends to insulate them from the encompassing context and thereby strengthens their flattering confidence in the subject's autarky. Under the name of freedom, their totality is contrasted with the totality of whatever restricts individuality. Yet the principium individuationis is by no means the metaphysical ultimate and unalterable, and thus it is not freedom either. Freedom is a moment rather in a twofold sense. It is entwined, not to be isolated, and for the time being it is never more than an instant of spontaneity, a historical node, the road to which is blocked under present conditions. The individual's independence, inappropriately stressed by liberal ideology, does not prevail, nor is there any denying his extremely real separation from society, which that ideology misinterprets. At times the individual would oppose him to society as an independent being, though a particular one, a being capable of rationally pursuing its own interest. In that phase, and beyond it, the question of freedom was the genuine question, whether society permits the individual to be as free as it promises. And thus it was also the question whether society itself is as free as it promises. Temporarily, the individual looms above the blind social context, but in his windowless isolation, he only helps so much more to reproduce that context. No less indicative of the historic experience that inside and outside are unreconciled is the thesis of unfreedom. Men are unfree because they are beholden to externality, and this externality in turn consists also of men themselves. As perceived in Hegel's phenomenology, it is only from that which has been divided from it, from that which is necessarily against it, that the subject acquires the concepts of freedom and unfreedom, which it will then relate to its own monadological structure. The pre-philosophical consciousness is located this side of the alternative, to a subject that acts naively and opposes itself to its environment. Its own conditioning is non-transparent. To dominate this conditioning, Consciousness must render it transparent. The thought, by means of its freedom, turns back to itself as its subject, and its sovereignty also leads to the concept of unfreedom. The two concepts are not a simple antithesis. They are interwoven. No theoretical curiosity can make us aware of this. It is the nature controlling sovereignty in its social form, dominion over people, that suggests the opposite to our consciousness, the idea of freedom. Its historical archetype was he who is topmost in hierarchies, the man who is not visibly dependent. In the abstract universal concept of things, quote, beyond nature, freedom is spiritualized into freedom from the realm of causality. With that, however, it becomes a self-deception. Psychologically speaking, the subject's interest in the thesis that it is free would be narcissistic, as immoderate as anything of the kind. There is narcissism even in Kant's arguments, for all his categorical localization of freedom in a sphere above psychology. According to his book, Foundation for a Metaphysics of Morals, everyone, including the, quote, most errant knave, end quote, need only be, quote, shown examples of honest intent, of constancy in following good maxims, of compassion, and of general goodwill, end quote, to wish that he too were so minded. He can expect no, quote, gratification of desires, end quote, from this. Quote, no condition that would satisfy any of his real or otherwise conceivable inclinations, but only a greater inner worth of his person. But he believes that he is this better person when he puts himself on the standpoint of a member of the intelligible world, a move he is involuntarily compelled to make by the idea of freedom, i.e. independence of determining causes from the sensible world, end quote. There is no effort Kant will not make to prove that this expectation of an enhanced interpersonal worth, this supposed motivation behind the thesis of freedom, rests in turn upon the moral law, on the very objectivity to which, on the other hand, consciousness is said to rise only on grounds of that expectation. And yet he cannot make us forget that in our view of freedom, the, quote, practical use of common human reason, end quote, is coupled with the need for self-exaltation, with the person's, quote, worth. That immediate consciousness, the, quote, common moral cognition of reason, end quote, which is the methodical starting point of Kant's foundation, will find itself no less interested in denying the same freedom which it claims. The more freedom the subject and the community of subjects ascribes to itself, the greater its responsibility, and before this responsibility it must fail in a bourgeois life, which in practice has never yet endowed a subject with the unabridged autonomy accorded to it in theory. Hence the subject must feel guilty. What makes the subject aware of the bounds of their freedom is that they are part of nature, and finally, that they are powerless against society, which has become independent of them. Yet the universality of the concept of freedom, a concept shared by the oppressed as well, recoils against dominion as freedom's model. Reacting to this recoil, those who have the privilege of freedom delight in finding others not yet ripe for freedom. They rationalize this persuasively by way of natural causality. The subjects are not only fused with their own psychical nature, a consistent legality holds sway also in the psychological realm, which reflection has laboriously divided from the world of bodies. This feeling rose proportionally with the soul's definition as a unit. But a sense of unfreedom exists no more than does an immediately evident sense of freedom. It always requires either that socially perceived phenomena be reflected upon the subject, the oldest instance is the so-called Platonic psychology, or that objectifications be performed by psychological science, in whose hands its discovery, the life of the soul, becomes a thing among things and falls under the causality predicated by the world of things. New section. The impulse before the ego. The dawning sense of freedom feeds upon the memory of the archaic impulse not yet steered by any solid I. The more the I curbs that impulse, the more chaotic and thus questionable will it find the pretemporal freedom. Without an anamnesis of the untamed impulse that precedes the ego, an impulse later banished to the zone of unfree bondage to nature, it would be impossible to derive the idea of freedom, although that idea in turn ends up reinforcing the ego. In spontaneity, the philosophical concept that does most to exalt freedom as a mode of conduct above empirical existence, there resounds the echo of that by whose control and ultimate destruction the I of idealistic philosophy means to prove its freedom. Through an apologia for its perverted form, society encourages the individuals to hypostatize their individuality and thus their freedom. As far as such a stubborn delusion extends, it is solely in pathogenesis states that a consciousness learns about its unfree side. In compulsion neuroses, for instance, they bid it act within the circumference of its own immanence, in line with laws which the consciousness experiences as alien to the I. Freedom is denied in its own native realm. Another metapsychological aspect of the pain of neuroses is their destruction of a convenient image. Quote, free within, unfree without. End quote. Although in its pathic condition, the subject will not come to see the truth conveyed by that condition, a truth which it can reconcile neither with its drives nor with its rational concerns. The truth content of neuroses is that the I has its unfreedom demonstrated to it within itself by something alien to it, by the feeling that, quote, this isn't me at all, end quote. Neuroses are true insofar as neuroses demonstrate the ego's unfreedom, precisely where its rule over its inner nature fails. Whatever falls under the unity of what traditional epistemology called, quote, personal self-consciousness, end quote, it's self-compulsive in nature, since all moments of that unity bear its stamp as that of illegality. All this seems free to the self-retrieving ego, whose idea of freedom derives from the model of its own rule, first from its rule over people and things, and then internalized from its rule over its entire concrete substance, which it commands by thinking it. This is not just the self-deception of immediacy blown up into an absolute. Only if one acts as an I, not just reactively, can his action be called free in any sense. And yet what would be equally free is that which is not tamed by the I as the principle of any determination, that which, as in Kant's moral philosophy, strikes the I as unfree and has indeed been unfree to this day. The progress of self-experience makes freedom as a datum problematical for this experience, and since the subject's interest in freedom will not dwindle, it sublimates freedom into an idea. Metapsychologically, this is verified by the psychoanalytical theory of repression. According to that theory, and dialectically enough, the repressing agent, the compulsive mechanism, is one with the I, the organon of freedom. In ourselves, by introspection, we discover neither a positive freedom nor a positive unfreedom. We conceive both in their relation to extramental things, freedom as a polemical counter-image to the suffering brought on by social coercion, unfreedom as the coercion's image. This is how little the subject is the, quote, sphere of absolute origins, end quote, as it will be philosophizingly called. The very definitions that uphold its claim to sovereignty always need also what is said to need nothing but them, as those definitions are understood. What is decisive in the ego, its independence and autonomy, can be judged only in relation to its otherness to the non-ego. Whether or not there is autonomy depends upon its adversary and antithesis, on the object which either grants or denies autonomy to the subject. Detached from the object, autonomy is fictitious. New section. Experimenta crucis. Consciousness cannot learn much about freedom from its self-experience, as witness the experimenta crucis of introspection. Not for nothing is the most popular one laid to an ass. Kant sticks to the same pattern in his attempt to show freedom by way of the decision to rise from a chair, a decision that would be more fitting in a play by Beckett. To decide cogently, empirically so to speak, whether the will is free, situations must be rigorously cleansed of their empirical content. The determinants we can perceive in the conditions that are created by the thought experiment must be as few as possible. But in every last clownish paradigm, the deciding subject is provided with rational reasons that would have to be chalked off as detriments. The experimenta are condemned to inanity by the principle on which decisions are supposed to be made, and this depreciates the decisions. Pure situations, a la Buridan, are not apt to occur where they are not devised or brought about in order to demonstrate freedom. And even if something of the kind were discoverable anywhere, it would be irrelevant to any person's life, and therefore, some word in Greek, for freedom. Some of Kant's experimenta crucis have greater pretensions, of course. They are dressed up as empirical evidence of the right to, quote, introduce freedom into science, end quote, since, quote, experience too confirms this order of concepts within us, end quote. Whereas empirical evidence of something, which in Kant's own theory is classified as supra-empirical, ought to arouse his suspicions. Rather, with the critical facts thus placed in the very sphere from which they are said to be removed as a matter of principle. And indeed, the example is not stringent. Quote, suppose one maintains that his carnal desire is quite irresistible for him if the beloved object and the opportunity for it were found. Ask him whether, if there were a gallows erected outside the house, where he finds that opportunity for hanging him as soon as he had slaked his lust, whether in this case he would not curb his desire. No need to guess about his answer, but ask him whether, if on the same instant pain of death, his sovereign ordered him to bear false witness against an honest man, for whose ruin the prince wants a pretext. Ask whether then, however great his love of life, he thinks it would be possible for him to overcome it. He may not dare say whether or not he would, but he must unhesitatingly admit the possibility. Therefore, in judging that he can do a thing because he feels he ought to do it, he comes to know within himself the freedom of which otherwise, without the moral laws, he would have remained ignorant. End quote. Kant. That the thing can be done, this is the man charged with, quote, carnal desire, end quote, would presumably concede as readily as the victim of coercion by the tyrant whom Kant respectfully calls his, quote, his sovereign, end quote. It would probably be the truth if both men, mindful of the weight which self-preservation carries in such decisions, denied knowing how they would act in the real situation. In that situation, psychological moments like the, quote, ego drive, and fear of death cannot fail to take forms differing from the improbable cogitative experiment that neutralizes them into ineffectively ponderable ideas. However consummate a man's integrity, there is no telling how he would act under torture. The situation, by then anything but fictitious, sets a limit upon what Kant takes for matters of course. His example does not, as he hoped, allow us to legitimize freedom by use and practice. The best we can do with it is shrug it off. Another Kantian example, that of the cardship, is no more serviceable. Quote, if a man has lost at cards, he may feel anger at himself and his imprudence, but if he is aware of having cheated, he must, even though he has won thereby, despise himself when he compares his action with the moral law. This then must be something other than the principle of one's own happiness. To be obliged to say to myself, quote, I am a knave although I have lined my pockets, and quote, I need a standard of judgment that differs from applauding myself and saying, quote, I am clever for I have enriched myself, end quote, end quote. Kant. Granting even that the cheat will reflect upon the moral law, whether or not he will despise himself is a crassly empirical question. He may be infantile and deem himself one of the chosen, but above all bourgeois responsibilities. He may chuckle at the successful caper, with his narcissism shielding him from the alleged self-disdain, or he may have acted in accordance with a moral code approved among his kind. The pathos with which he would have to brand himself a knave is based on recognition of Kant's moral law, of the law Kant wants to base upon the example, in the group of all those covered by the concept of moral insanity. For instance, that law is suspended, yet they are by no means irrational. It is only metaphorically that they can be classed with the insane. When any thesis about the mundus intelligibilis, I don't know how to say this, mundus intelligibilis seeks comfort from the empirical world, it must put up with empirical criteria, and these criteria speak against the comfort, in line with the speculative thought's aversion to the so-called, quote, example. As to the something inferior, Kant's work is not lacking in displays of that aversion. Quote, this is also the only great benefit of examples, that they sharpen the power of judgment. For as regards the accuracy and precision of intellectual insight, they commonly tend somewhat to impair this, rather because they seldom adequately meet the conditions of the rule, as casus in terminus, and because, moreover, they often weaken the intellectual's effort to understand the sufficiency of rules in general, independently of the particular circumstances of experience, and they therefore ultimately breed a habit of using rules like formulas more than as principles. Thus examples are the leading strings of judgment, which he who lacks a natural gift for that power can never do without. End quote. Contrary to his own insight, Kant did not disdain to use examples in the critique of practical reason. He needed them, one suspects, because empirical subreption was the only way to demonstrate the relation between existence and the formal moral law, and thus the possibility of the imperative. This is the vengeance exacted by Kant's philosophy. Kant's examples are stabs at thin air. The absurdity of moral experiments may have its core in their coupling of incompatibilities, in their undertaking to calculate things which are beyond the realm of calculability. Footnote: The Kantian cogitative experiments are not unlike existentialist ethics. Kant knew well that goodwill is conveyed in the continuity of a lifetime rather than in isolated acts. But in the experiment, to make it prove what it should, he exacerbates goodwill into a choice between two alternatives. That continuity hardly exists anymore, which is why Sartre, in a kind of regression to the 18th century, clings to the decision alone. Yet the alternative situation, which is supposed to demonstrate autonomy, is heteronymous before every matter of substance. Kant needs a despot for one of his exemplary situations of choice. Analogously, many of Sartre's situations are derived from fascism, and true as indictments of fascism, not as a condition humane. A free man would only be one who needs not bow to any alternatives. And under existing circumstances, there is a touch of freedom in refusing to accept the alternatives. Freedom means to criticize and change situations, not to confirm them by deciding within their coercive structure. Brecht, in defiance of his official creed, helped this insight along after a talk with students, when he followed up his doctrinal collectivist piece on, quote, yes-sayer with the deviating, quote, naysayer, end quote. End footnote. New section, the addendum. Despite all this, the experiments show a movement which we may call the addendum, in line with the vague way it is experienced. The subject's decisions do not roll off in a causal chain. What occurs is a jolt, rather. In traditional philosophy, this factual addendum in which consciousness externalizes itself is again interpreted as nothing but consciousness. It is supposed to intervene, as if the intervention were somehow conceivable to the pure mind. Construed to this end is quod erat demonstrandum, that the subject's reflection alone is able, if not to break through natural causality, at least to change its direction by adding other motivational chains. The self-experience of the moment of freedom depends on consciousness. The subject knows itself to be free only insofar as its action strikes it as identical with it, and that is the case in conscious actions only. In those alone can subjectivity laboriously, ephemerally raise its head. But the insistence on this was rationalistically narrowed. In that sense, Kant, in keeping with his conception of practical reason, is that which is truly, quote, pure, that is, sovereign in relation to any material, kept clinging to the school overthrown by his critique of theoretical reason. Consciousness, rational insight, is not simply the same as a free act. We cannot flatly equate it with the will. Yet this is precisely what happens in Kant's thinking. To Kant, the will is the epitome of freedom, the, quote, power, end quote, to act freely, the unifying characteristic of all acts conceived as free. Of the categories which, quote, in the field of the supersensory, end quote, are, quote, necessarily connected, end quote, with the, quote, determining ground of the pure will, end quote, he teaches, quote, that they always refer only to intelligent beings, and even in these only to the relation of reason to the will, and thus always only to practice, end quote. It is through the will, he says, that reason creates its reality, untrammeled by the material, whatever its kind. This may be what the formulations scattered throughout Kant's moral philosophical writings converge upon. In the book, Foundation for a Metaphysics of Morals, the will is, quote, conceived as a faculty to make oneself act according to the idea of certain laws, end quote. Kant. Footnote. The, quote, idea of certain laws, end quote, is tantamount to the concept of pure reason, defined by Kant, after all, as, quote, the faculty of deriving cognition from principles, end quote. End footnote. Later, in the Foundation for a Metaphysics of Morals, the will is said to be, quote, a sort of causality of living creatures, provided they are rational, and freedom would be the quality of this causality, since it can be at work independently of alien causes that determine it, end quote. Kant. The oxymoron, quote, causality of freedom, end quote, appearing in the thesis of the third antinomy and explicated in the Foundation, owes its plausibility solely to the abstraction which is reason exhausts the will without a remainder. In fact, freedom turns for Kant into a quality of the causality of living subjects because it lies beyond alien determining causes, and because it contracts into that necessity which coincides with reason. His view of the will as, quote, a faculty of purposes, end quote, in the book Critique of Practical Reason, takes its bearings from the concept of objective purposes. And yet the will is still interpreted as theoretical reason, since the purposes, quote, are at all times determining causes of the faculty of desire according to principles, end quote. To be conceived as principles, however, are solely the laws of reason, tacitly endowed with power to direct the faculty of desire, which in turn belongs to the sensible world. As the pure, some word in Greek, the will becomes a no man's land between subject and object, antinomical in a manner not envisioned in the Critique of Reason. And yet it is at the outset of the self-emancipating modern subject's self-reflection in Shakespeare's Hamlet that we find the divergence of insight and action paradigmatically laid down. The more the subject turns into a being for itself, the greater the distance it places between itself and the unbroken accord with a given order, the less will its actions and its consciousness be one. The addendum as an aspect which, under rationalistic rules, is irrational. It denies the Cartesian dualism of res extensa and res cogitans, in which the addendum as mental is lumped with the res cogitans, regardless of the difference that separates it from the thought.
Are you going to eat soup today, or should I freeze it?
You can freeze it. The addendum has an aspect which... Where the hell am I? The more the subject turns into a being for itself, the greater the distance it places between itself and the unbroken accord with a given order, the less will its actions and its consciousness be one. The addendum has an aspect which under rationalistic rules is irrational. It denies the Cartesian dualism of res extensa and res cogitans, in which the addendum as mental is lumped with the res cogitans, regardless of the difference that separates it from the thought. The addendum is an impulse, the rudiment of a phase in which the dualism of extramental and intramental was not thoroughly consolidated yet, neither volitively bridgeable nor an ontological ultimate. This also affects the concept of the will that contains so-called, quote, facts of consciousness, end quote, which at the same time purely descriptive are more than such facts. This lies hidden in the will's transition to practice. The impulse, instrumental and somatic, in one, drives beyond the conscious sphere to which it belongs just the same. With that impulse, freedom extends to the realm of experience. This animates the concept of freedom as a state that would no more be blind nature than it would be oppressed nature. Its phantasm, which reason will not allow to be withered by any proof of causal interdependence, is the phantasm of a reconciling nature and nature and the mind. This is not as alien to reason as it would seem under the aspect of reason's Kantian equation with the will. It does not drop from heaven. To philosophical reflection it appears as downright otherness, because the will that has been reduced to pure practical reason is an abstraction. The addendum is the name for that which was eliminated in this abstraction. Without it there would be no real will at all. It is a flash of light between the poles of something long past, something grown all but unrecognizable, and that which some day might come to be. True practice, the totality of acts that would satisfy the idea of freedom, does indeed require full theoretical consciousness. Indecisionism, which strikes out reason in the passage to the act is delivered to the automatism of dominion. The unreflected freedom to which it presumes comes to serve total unfreedom. We have been taught this lesson by Hitler's Reich and its union of decisionism and social Darwinism, the affirmative extension of natural causality. But practice also needs something else, something physical which consciousness does not exhaust, something conveyed to reason and qualitatively different from reason. The two moments are by no means separately experienced, but philosophical analysis has tailored the phenomenon in such a way that afterwards, in philosophical language, it simply cannot be put otherwise than as if something else were added to rationality. Kant, by allowing no movens of practice but reason, remained under the spell of that fated theory, against which he devised the primacy of practical reason as a complement. This is what ails his entire moral philosophy, the part of action that differs from pure consciousness, the pure consciousness which in Kant's eyes compels the action, the part that abruptly leaps out. This is spontaneity, which Kant also transplanted into pure consciousness, lest the constitutive function of the quote, I think, be imperiled. In Kant's work, the memory of what has been eliminated survives only in the twofold exegesis of an instrumentally interpreted spontaneity. On the one hand, it is thinking, an act of consciousness. On the other hand, it is unconscious and involuntary, the heartbeat of the res cogitans, and yet beyond it. Pure consciousness, quote, logic itself, has come to be. It is a validity that has submerged its genesis. Its genesis lies in a moment which the Kantian doctrine skips, in the negation of the will, which according to Kant would be pure consciousness. Logic is a practice insulated against itself. Contemplative conduct, the subjective correlate of logic, is the conduct that wills nothing. Conversely, each act of the will breaks through the mechanical autarky of logic, and this is what makes theory and practice antithetical. Kant turns the matter upside down. Though the addendum may always be more sublimated with increasing consciousness, though indeed the concept of the will as something substantial and unanimous may only be formed in that increase, if the motor form of reaction were liquidated altogether. If the hand no longer twitched, there would be no will. What the great rationalistic philosophers conceived as the will is already, and without auctioning for it, a denial of the will. The Schopenhauer of Book 4 had every right to feel that he was a Kantian. The Schopenhauer of Book 4 had every right to feel that he was a Kantian. The fact that without a will there is no consciousness is blurred for the idealist by sheer identity, as if the will were nothing else but consciousness. In the most profound concept of transcendental epistemology, the concept of productive imagination, the trace of the will invades the pure intellective function. Once that has happened, spontaneity is curiously skipped in the will. It is not merely reason that is genetically evolved from the force of human drives as their differentiation. Without the kind of willing that is manifested in the arbitrary nature of every thought act, the kind that furnishes our only reason to distinguish such an act from the subject's passive, quote, receptive, and quote, moments, there would be no thinking in the proper sense of the word. But idealism has taken an oath to the contrary and must not admit that on pain of its own destruction. This explains the distortion as well as its proximity to the true facts. Okay. So that is the end of video 1 of chapter 1 of part 3 of Adorno's negative dialectics. Part 3 is titled Models, and chapter 1 is titled Freedom on the Metacritique of Practical Reason. I'm not exactly sure how many sections there will be of this chapter, but considering that it's 90 pages, I'm going to break it down. It looks like it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It looks like there could be 7 parts, but I'm not sure yet. Thank you so much for listening.